There's something almost sacred about the moment when you believe you're completely safe. When every worry dissolves, every anxiety fades, and you're wrapped in the quiet certainty that everything will be okay. I had that moment. Pure, untainted peace. Exactly 1 second before 37 lives, including mine, hung suspended between the mountain road and the abyss below. They say time slows down in crisis, but what they don't tell you is how achingly beautiful that last second of normalcy can be, how it burns itself into your memory like sunlight through glass. The morning of September 15th started like any other Tuesday. I was 24, fresh, out of college, and finally living the adventure I'd dreamed about since I was 12. My backpack was loaded with everything I owned, my savings account was nearly empty, and my heart was fuller than it had ever been. I was 3 weeks into what I'd boldly called my soul-searching journey through the mountains of Peru. Though honestly, I was probably just running from the suffocating expectations of adult life back home. The hostel in Cusco had been buzzing, with travelers like me. Germans with their meticulous itineraries, Australians with their infectious laughter, Americans like myself trying to find meaning in ancient ruins and coca tea. We were all seeking something: adventure, purpose, maybe just good Instagram photos to prove we were living authentic lives. I'd met Sarah at breakfast that morning. She was from Oregon, studying photography, and had the kind of genuine smile that made you want to tell her your entire life story over coffee. We'd spent the previous evening walking through the cobblestone streets, talking about dreams and fears and all those deep things you only discuss with strangers you'll probably never see again. There was something magical about that, the honesty that comes from temporary connections. "You should come to Machu Picchu with us," she'd said, her camera slung around her neck like a badge of belonging. "There's a bus that leaves at noon, and the guide says the light is perfect for sunset photos." I almost said no. My original plan was to take the train. More expensive, but supposedly safer. But Sarah had this way of making everything sound like an adventure, and I was 24 and immortal, and absolutely certain that good things happened to people who said yes to life. The bus was an old thing, painted in cheerful blues and yellows, that seemed to mock its actual mechanical condition. As we climbed aboard, I noticed the worn tires, the rust spots, the way the engine coughed like an old man with too many cigarettes behind him. But the other passengers seemed relaxed. Locals who made this journey regularly, tourists clutching their cameras and guidebooks, everyone trusting that we'd arrive safely because we always had before. I chose a window seat on the left side, wanting to watch the mountain scenery roll by. Sarah sat across the aisle, already adjusting her camera settings for the shots she planned to take. Behind us, an elderly Peruvian couple shared a bag of homemade cookies, their weathered hands intertwined, like roots that had grown together over decades. A young father held his daughter, maybe 5 years old, pointing out landmarks through the window and whispering stories in Spanish that made her giggle. The road to Machu Picchu is a winding ribbon of asphalt carved into mountainsides that seem to scrape the sky. It's breathtaking in the most literal sense. Your lungs work harder in the thin air, and your eyes struggle to process the vast distances between peaks. For the first hour, I pressed my face to the window like a child, watching as we climbed higher and higher, leaving the familiar world behind for something that felt mythical. The driver was a stocky man in his 50s who hummed old folk songs under his breath. He'd been making this journey for 15 years, he told us during a brief stop, and he knew every curve, every pothole, every place where the guardrail had been repaired after previous accidents. His confidence was infectious. Here was a man who understood these mountains, who respected them, but wasn't afraid of them. As we continued climbing, I found myself relaxing in a way I hadn't in months. The stress of job applications, student loans, and my parents' well-meaning but suffocating questions about my future seemed to dissolve into the mountain air. This was why I'd come to Peru. Not just to see ancient ruins, but to remember what it felt like to be present in my own life, to trust that the universe had a plan even when I couldn't see it. Sarah was napping across the aisle, her camera cradled, in her lap like a sleeping pet. The elderly couple had pulled out a deck of cards and were playing some game that involved a lot of gentle teasing and laughter. The little girl had fallen asleep against her father's shoulder, her tiny hands still clutching a stuffed llama she'd bought at the market. We were a small community united by destination, strangers who'd become temporarily family through the simple act of sharing a journey. I remember thinking how beautiful that was, how travel breaks down the walls we build around ourselves and reminds us that we're all just people trying to get somewhere, literally and metaphorically. The afternoon sun was painting the mountains, in shades of gold and amber, when we rounded what would later be called the curve. I was watching a condor circling in the distance, marveling at how something so large could look so graceful against the immensity of the sky. My mind was quiet, my heart was full, and for perhaps the first time in my adult life, I felt completely, utterly safe. It was 3:47 p.m. when perfection crystallized into a single second. I was looking out the window, watching shadows dance across, ancient stone faces carved into the mountainside, when a profound sense of peace settled over me like a warm blanket. It wasn't just contentment. It was something deeper, a bone-deep certainty that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. The worries that had followed me from home seemed ridiculous now, tiny problems from a tiny life I'd temporarily escaped. Sarah stirred across the aisle, her camera making a soft clicking sound as she instinctively adjusted it in her sleep. The elderly woman behind me was softly humming the same melody her husband had been humming earlier, some love song they'd probably shared for decades. The little girl mumbled something in Spanish, her dreams mixing with the gentle rumble of the bus engine and the whisper of mountain wind through partially open windows. I pressed my palm against the cool glass and watched the world slide by at what felt like the perfect speed, fast enough to feel like we were making progress, slow enough to actually see the beauty we were passing through. There's something hypnotic about watching landscape from a moving vehicle, the way distant objects seem to move slowly while nearby rocks and trees blur past in streaks of color and texture. The driver downshifted as we approached a curve, and I felt that familiar sensation of the bus leaning slightly as we followed the mountain's natural contours. It was a movement I'd grown accustomed to over the past 3 hours, the gentle sway that reminded you that you were suspended between earth and sky, trusting physics and engineering and human competence to keep you tethered to safety. I remember thinking about my grandmother in that moment. She died 6 months before my trip, and her last words to me had been about adventure. "Don't wait for permission to live your life," she'd whispered, her voice paper-thin but her grip on my hand surprisingly strong. "Promise me you'll see beautiful things." Sitting in that bus, watching condors ride thermals between peaks that had witnessed civilization's rise and fall, I felt like I was keeping that promise. The sun had shifted just enough to throw new shadows across my lap, and I noticed how the light caught the dust motes floating in the air, transforming ordinary particles into tiny golden stars. Everything felt magical, significant, like the universe was showing off just for us. 37 strangers who'd had the wisdom to say yes to this particular adventure on this particular day. I closed my eyes for just a moment, letting the sounds of the journey wash over me. The steady hum of tires on asphalt, the occasional creak of the bus's metal frame adjusting to the mountain road's demands, the soft breathing of sleeping passengers, the distant call of some bird I couldn't identify. It was a symphony of normalcy, of safety, of the reliable predictability that allows us to plan futures and make promises and believe that tomorrow will be more or less like today. When I opened my eyes, I was smiling. Not the forced smile you put on for photos, but the involuntary expression of pure contentment. I was alive. I was healthy. I was exactly where I wanted to be. surrounded by people I was growing to care about despite knowing them for less than a day. The narrow road felt solid beneath us. The guardrail looked sturdy enough, and our driver's steady hands on the wheel radiated decades of competence and familiarity with these mountains. I turned to check on Sarah and saw that she was awake. Now, her camera raised to capture something through her window. She caught my eye and grinned, mouthing the words, "So beautiful," with the kind of wonder that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with travel in the first place. Behind her, the elderly couple was sharing what looked like the last cookie from their bag, breaking it carefully in half with the tenderness of people who've spent a lifetime considering each other's needs before their own. The little girl had woken up and was pointing excitedly at something I couldn't see, chattering to her father in rapid Spanish while he nodded and responded with the patient enthusiasm of someone who finds joy in his child's joy. Her stuffed llama had fallen to the floor, and I considered picking it up for her, but she seemed too enchanted by whatever she was seeing to notice. This was it, I realized. This was the moment I'd remember when I was old and gray and telling stories about my adventures to grandchildren who might or might not exist. Not the destination. Machu Picchu was still an hour away. But this perfect, unremarkable moment when everything felt right with the world. When I felt safe, not just physically, but existentially. When the future seemed full of possibility, and the past felt forgiven, and the present was exactly enough. I pressed my forehead against the cool window and watched the road curve ahead of us, disappearing around a rocky outcrop before reappearing, higher up the mountain like a promise. The afternoon light was getting richer, painting everything in shades of gold and amber that made even the most ordinary rocks look precious. In the distance, I could see other buses making the same journey, tiny moving dots connected by ribbons of asphalt to the same dream of seeing something ancient and magnificent. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother, probably asking if I was being safe, eating enough, remembering to call. I ignored it, not out of rudeness, but because I didn't want to break the spell of this moment. I didn't want to reassure anyone that I was okay, because I was more than okay. I was perfect. We were perfect. This whole beautiful, precarious, impossible journey was perfect. The bus downshifted again, and I felt that familiar lean as we entered another curve. The driver hummed a few bars of his folk song, his hands steady on the wheel, his confidence a blanket of security that covered all of us. We were in good hands. We were safe. We were 1 second. That's all it was. 1 second of pure, untainted belief that everything would be fine. The thing about falling is that it's nothing like the movies. There's no slow-motion montage, no profound realization accompanied by swelling orchestral music. There's just the sudden absence of everything you thought you could count on. Gravity working in your favor, physics obeying predictable rules, the future unfolding in the orderly way you'd planned. 1 second I was contemplating the golden light on distant peaks. The next, I was watching that same light spin and tumble as our bus left the road and began its conversation with the mountain's unforgiving slope. The world became a kaleidoscope of sky and stone, of screaming metal and screaming voices, of the terrible realization that safety had been an illusion all along. I don't remember the impact. The human brain, in its infinite mercy, sometimes chooses to edit out the moments too terrible to file away in accessible memory. What I remember is waking up, if you can call it waking when you're not sure you were ever really asleep, to a silence so complete it felt like the world had ended. The absence of the engine's hum, the strange new weight of gravity pulling from a different direction, the dust settling like snow in the afternoon light that now slanted through windows that should have been walls. Sarah was hanging upside down in her seat, her camera strap wrapped around her arm like a twisted prayer. She was conscious, blinking slowly, her lips moving in what might have been words, or might have been just the automatic response of a mind trying to process the impossible. Blood was running upward from a cut on her forehead. Upward, because Up and down had become negotiable concepts in our new reality. The elderly couple wasn't moving. They were still holding hands, but their bodies were arranged in positions that spoke of forces too violent for human frames to accommodate. Their cookie bag had exploded, filling the air with crumbs that caught the dusty sunlight like confetti. At the worst party ever thrown, I tried to call out to them, but my voice came out as a whisper, then not at all. The little girl was crying. Not the dramatic wailing of a child denied a toy, but the quiet, hiccuping sobs of someone who understands that something fundamental has broken. Her father was trying to reach her, his arm twisted at an angle that made my stomach turn, but his eyes were alert and focused entirely on his daughter. "Está bien, mi amor," he kept saying, though nothing was okay and we all knew it. "Papa está aquí. Daddy is here." I tried to move and discovered that moving was no longer a simple matter of intention followed by action. My left leg was pinned under something, a piece of the bus's interior that had become a foreign object, a puzzle piece that no longer fit the picture we'd been trying to complete. Pain was a delayed reaction, arriving in waves that made breathing an active choice rather than an automatic function. But I was alive. Against all probability, against the evidence of twisted metal and broken glass, and the 30-foot drop that should have killed us all, I was alive. 37 people had boarded that bus in Cusco, and I began the terrible arithmetic of trying to count how many of us were still making the sounds that indicated life. Breathing, crying, calling out names of people who might or might not be able to answer. The driver, the confident man who'd hummed folk songs and radiated competence, was slumped over what remained of the steering wheel. His humming had stopped forever, but his hands were still positioned as if he was trying to steer us back to safety even after safety had become an impossible destination. There was something heartbreaking about that, about the human instinct to keep trying even when trying is no longer enough. Emergency responders arrived with the impossible speed of people who've done this before, who understand that minutes matter in the mathematics of survival. They rappelled down the slope like angels in fluorescent vests, carrying equipment that could turn twisted metal into passable doorways, unconscious bodies into treatable patients, disaster into something survivable. For those lucky enough to have won the cosmic lottery of position and timing, and the 1,000 tiny variables that separate the living from the dead. Was evacuated by helicopter, my first and last helicopter ride. An experience that should have been thrilling, but was instead surreal, dreamlike, accompanied by the steady beep of medical equipment and the professional calm of paramedics who spoke in codes I didn't understand, but trusted completely. Below us, the bus looked like a child's toy that had been thrown in anger, crumpled and discarded on the mountainside, where it would probably rust until the next century. The hospital in Lima was a maze of white walls and worried faces and forms that needed to be filled out in languages I barely spoke. My parents arrived within 48 hours, having taken the first flight they could find and probably aged 10 years in the process. My mother cried when she saw me, not the dramatic tears of relief you see in movies, but the quiet, exhausted weeping of someone who'd spent 2 days imagining the worst and hadn't quite accepted that the worst hadn't happened. Sarah survived, though her photography career took a different direction after that. She sent me a message 6 months later saying she'd switched to landscapes. No more buses, no more enclosed spaces where other people's decisions determined whether she lived or died. The little girl survived too, though her father didn't. She was adopted by relatives in California, and I sometimes wonder if she remembers that day, if she dreams about stuffed llamas and mountain roads, and the moment when Daddy stopped being able to keep her safe. 17 people died in what the newspaper called a tragic accident on the mountain road to Machu Picchu. 17 people who'd woken up that morning, planning to see ancient ruins and take photographs and buy souvenirs to prove they'd been somewhere beautiful. The elderly couple was among them, their love story ending in the same moment, their hands still intertwined when the rescuers found them. I spent 3 months in physical therapy, relearning how to trust my body to carry me through the world. But the physical healing was nothing compared to the psychological reconstruction required to believe in safety again, to board vehicles driven by strangers, to sleep without dreaming of spinning sky and screaming metal. The investigation revealed what investigations always reveal: a combination of factors too complex to blame on any single decision or person. Worn brake pads, a moment of driver inattention, a guardrail that met the minimum safety requirements but not the maximum ones. The mountain road had been used safely for decades, but safety, it turns out, is a statistical concept rather than a guarantee. I never made it to Machu Picchu. The ruins I'd traveled so far to see remained unseen, a destination that became irrelevant the moment our bus left the road. But I learned something more valuable than any photograph or guidebook could have taught me: that the second before disaster strikes is often the most beautiful second of all, because it's the last moment when we're allowed to believe that everything will be okay. Now, 5 years later, I understand that safety is not a permanent state, but a temporary grace. Every morning, I wake up healthy. Every plane that lands safely. Every routine drive that ends with arrival rather than accident. These are gifts, not guarantees. The elderly couple sharing cookies, the little girl pointing at mountains, Sarah adjusting her camera for the perfect shot. We were all living in that precious space between planning and reality, between intention and outcome. Still travel, though differently now. I've learned to notice the moment when I feel completely safe, to recognize it as the gift it is rather than the certainty I once believed it to be. I've learned that trust is an act of courage, not ignorance, and that choosing to board buses and make plans and believe in tomorrows is perhaps the most defiant thing humans do in a universe that makes no promises about duration or safety. The 1 second before moment isn't about the tragedy that follows. It's about the preciousness of feeling safe, of trusting that the next moment will unfold as gently as the last. If this story moved you, if it reminded you to notice those moments of perfect peace in your own life, please share it with someone you care about. And remember, every second you feel safe is a second worth celebrating, because safety isn't guaranteed. It's grace. What was your 1 second before moment? Share it in the comments below.